Good morning and welcome to day 18 of Geriatric1944's Coronavirus Diaries. I had so many messages about my diary entry yesterday about John Lennon that I'm going to talk a great deal more about him. But before that, two things I wanted to say. One, delighted that Boris Johnson seems to be coming through. I gather that the general percentage of people who survive if they're on a ventilator is 50%, but if they're not on a ventilator, as Boris wasn't, it's 70%. And for those coronavirus people who catch the disease but either have no symptoms or mild symptoms or symptoms like I had, i.e. a bad cold or flu, if it was coronavirus, it's about 99.9% survive. So let's bring all this into perspective as we watch the media continue to inflate this as a plague that's destroying the world, and has interviews with people who've survived it and their sobbing relatives and friends, and there's always tears, lots of tears everywhere, and gratitude to people looking after them. The reality is far more people are dying every day through cancer caused by smoking, cigarettes, by car accidents and road accidents, by various other things, flu, measles, tuberculosis, polio, mumps, whooping cough. Let's not forget, this is a media-created plague that actually is tiny and trivial compared to the reality. Do not fall for the fact that the emperor has new clothes. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to mention, other than saying I'm delighted that Boris is better, as one is delighted that any human being is better, over the Easter weekend you will see, starting on ITV, a show called Quiz, which is fantastic, written by James Graham. I went and saw the play in Chichester, and it's based on a book by my dear friend, sadly now passed away, Bob Woffinden. He also at the same time wrote this book, The Nicholas Cases, which actually is about the 10 worst miscarriages of justice, in his opinion, in the last 30 years in Great Britain. And mine is one of the cases that he covers at length. One entire chapter is devoted to my case. The mighty Bob Woffinden, who wrote, I think, a book called Bad Show about this, and whose book was so brilliantly researched because he was a fantastic researcher, is the basis of Quiz. And James Graham, if you're watching this, and ITV, if you're watching this, and anybody else who's writing about it before it happens or reviews it afterwards, I think it's going to be very good. I believe it's a 3-parter. Do please credit Bob Woffinden for all the research that's done on it, which is a very interesting and fascinating story. Bob would turn into a very dear friend of mine, and we were talking a great deal during all his investigations into it and many other cases. Anyway, John Lennon. John was a very good friend of mine. I really liked him. He was a typical Scouser in many ways. He did have a dreadful streak of cruelty in him, which I think was inspired by bad events that had happened to him in his childhood. Funnily enough, I liken him very much to another really close friend of mine, Kenny Everett, the DJ. Both John and Kenny, who were both Scousers, had the same kind of characters. There was this streak inside them, almost self-destruction, of trying to push anybody who he got really, really close to into admitting that they couldn't stand them and therefore they should leave. And the temptations that people who were loved by, certainly by Kenny, and who got pushed away are unbelievable. But I've got to tell you, neither Kenny nor John ever showed me that side. And sometimes when they were showing it to others, because they could be terribly cruel to fans and people who came up to them and said, "Oh, I love your work," and then their answer was inevitably, "Why don't you fuck off?" But I watched both of them go through these terrible things, and afterwards they turned to me and say, "Oh, well, I'm sorry about that, JK. I really can't stand stand these sort of people or whatever. Neither of them were ever nasty to me. I saw them being nasty to so many people. John was horrible to Paul McCartney when the Beatles split up and after the Beatles split up, although I'm sure he didn't actually mean it, and I'm sure today Paul would forgive him everything. But I just wanted to tell the story of how I had Yoko Ono on my TV show way back in 1967, I think it was. And John and I were out for dinner or in a club that night, and John said he'd watched it. He was grilling me about Yoko. I think he'd either seen her or met her before, but only very briefly. But he wanted to know everything about her. And I was thinking, hang on, and she was just a guest on my TV show. She wasn't that important. But he wanted to know if I'd met the husband or the daughter, what she was like, everything about her. And I kept saying, John, this really isn't important. He said, yeah, I need to know this. Went on for about an hour. Well, of course, later on, they fell in love and got married and actually had a generally very happy relationship between the two of them. But I'll always remember that in the early days before they had any kind of relationship. And the other thing I remember about John was one time we were in a club and we were talking about making records. And John said to me, well, you know, what I like to do is if there's a record I really love, I work out what I really love about it. I play it literally 1,000,000 times. And then I try and write a song that uses the bits that I loved about that particular song and makes them into a brand new song. But the vital thing is nobody must even guess where the original inspiration came from. And I said, yes, I do exactly the same thing. And I'd just done it with a track of mine called It's a Tall Order for a Short Guy, which was very much based on the Betty Wright Clean Up Woman track. As anybody listening to the first one will know, that I basically got the riff from that and then wrote an entirely new and very different song around the sort of guitar riff that they used. Well, John was fascinated by this, insisted that we leave the club immediately, rushed back to my home, and I played him the track at least 50 times. He absolutely loved it because he wasn't a big fan of my music. He never liked Everyone's Gone to the Moon. But we discussed it and talked through, and he then told me about some of his songs, sadly, which I can't remember any of them, of which ones were nicked from where and how he'd done it. But it was actually a really fascinating time. I miss John. He was a highly intelligent, very amusing, very witty man and was a very good friend. And I was very upset when he died. Funnily enough, I was due to have lunch with him in New York 2 or 3 days after he died, and we booked it in beforehand. And I remember telling Tom Brooke, who was the BBC correspondent at the time, that I thought John had been killed, and indeed he had, which was very tragic. 1980, if I remember right. Time goes so quickly, it only feels like that now. I'd like to play out with my track, It's a Tall Order for a Short Guy, and see what you think of it. I think it's a damn good track, actually. It's mine, and it was recorded in, I can't remember when, I think the early 70s. Anyway, enjoy it. This has been my coronavirus diary for day 18. See you tomorrow, day 19.
It's a tall order for a short guy to stand right up and look her in the eye. She can rip me off and bring me down, shake me up, run me out of town. It's a tall order for a short guy, but I'm gonna try. the time.